more hotter, I guess, red, orange, to even eventually just a brown stream of like smoke trailing you, and eventually to get the drogue chutes out that stabilize you as you're coming through, I think about 60,000 feet. Then you wait for really what means you really got it made is when you see the main chutes deploy. Obviously, in our case, we got all 3 chutes out, and that's the first time you know you're really home. Splashdown itself might be a little jolting. In our case, that wasn't as bad as I suspected it might be when you're finally home.
On the way down towards the sea, I can imagine some big smiles on all of your faces. Were you talking to each other and relieved and saying some prayers of thanks, perhaps? You have been on one of the most incredible.
Caution, road with restricted access.
Not much conversation. We had post-landing checklists to go through to get the vehicle safe and ready for when the divers outside safed everything and got ready to open the hatch. No, there was no conversation I recall about what had transpired at that point or what our mutually our feelings were. It wasn't like Hollywood, everybody shouts and slaps everybody on the back, and no, there was none of that.
Although Apollo 13 is one of NASA's most famous missions, none of the astronauts ever returned to space.
Fred Hayes was speaking to Richard Howells in 2010 for Witness History on the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service, exploring the arts, culture and music from around the world.
I create work with natural materials like driftwood or sand. My studio is the beach.
I like writing about creepy people and weird people and strange families and odd houses. Performing live when it's in the right environment. Something that I can really kind of lose myself in, and I love that.
Arts, music and culture from the BBC World Service. In 30 minutes, the documentary.
I'm in Georgia's capital, Tbilisi, where the underground music community has become an integral part of political activism in the country. How vital is dancing in a country going through the biggest political and social crisis of its generation?
The newsroom is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello and welcome to the newsroom. Beijing has promised over $50 billion in financing to African nations.
Looking to the future, I propose raising China's bilateral relations with all African countries that have diplomatic ties to the level of strategic relationships.
We'll look at the benefits and the possible pitfalls of close-knit ties. Also today at 8 hours GMT with me, Nick Miles. The US Secretary of State is on his way to Haiti. What has he got to offer a nation that's riven with insecurity and under a state of emergency? After more people drown trying to get into the UK on flimsy boats, we hear from people in France who blame the authorities there.
Buggies and drones and helicopters, all this is achieving is more death. It is provoking those migrants who want to cross to take greater risks.
And a Maori farewell to the King in New Zealand and the crowning of a new Queen, his only daughter. After this bulletin.
Hello, I'm Roisin Hastie with the BBC News. China's president has promised over $50 billion in financing for Africa over the next 3 years and to help create 1 million jobs on the continent. Addressing the China-Africa Forum, Beijing's biggest in years, Xi Jinping said China's relations with Africa were their best period in history. From Beijing, here's Laura Bicker.
The 3-day Africa Forum in Beijing is being billed by Chinese state media as the most important diplomatic event of the year. Africa, which is rich in mineral and oil resources and has a population of more than 1 billion people, has become the focus of intense competition between China, Europe and the United States. In a bid to strengthen Beijing's influence, President Xi urged the leaders of 50 African nations to walk hand in hand with China on the path towards modernization.
The Ugandan marathon runner Rebecca Cheptegei has died 4 days after being set on fire in an alleged attack by her former boyfriend. The Olympic athlete was reportedly doused with petrol at her home in Western Kenya, where she'd been training. Cheptegei, who was 33, sustained burns on more than 70% of her body. The boyfriend was also injured. Local reports suggest the two had argued over the software Pegasus. In a television broadcast, the former left-wing rebel said the software could have been used to spy on politicians, including himself, during the right-wing administration of Ivan Duque.
Para la compra de Pegasus.
The Police Intelligence Directorate bought Pegasus in cash for $11 million from an Israeli company. They bought this software to spy on mobile phones in the middle of the social unrest and before the campaigns. It's the Police Intelligence Directorate that did this.
Y lo hizo ahí.
You're listening to the latest world news from the BBC. Police in the US state of Georgia say a 14-year-old student is being held after a shooting at a high school in which 4 people, 2 pupils and 2 teachers, were killed. The director of Georgia's police force said the suspect, who had surrendered to police at Appalachia High School in Winder, would be charged with murder and tried as an adult. South Korea has experienced its hottest summer since records began 50 years ago. The average temperature from June to August was nearly 2 degrees Celsius above normal. It also experienced a record number of what it calls tropical nights. These are nights when the temperature does not dip below 25 degrees Celsius. South Korean officials said climate change was altering the country's weather patterns. The US Geological Survey says a powerful earthquake has struck close to the northern coast of Papua New Guinea. The magnitude 6 tremor was located around 300 kilometers east of the town of Wanamo, which is preparing to host Pope Francis at the weekend. In tennis, the women's world number 1 Iga Swiatek has been knocked out of the US Open by the American 6th seed Jessica Pegula, who reached her first major semi-final in straight sets. In the men's tournament, Britain's Jack Draper beat Australia's Alex de Minaur in the quarter-final. Russell Fuller reports.
Alex de Minaur was not 100% fit following a hip injury which denied him the chance to play Novak Djokovic in the quarter-finals at Wimbledon, but Jack Draper was still able to complete a 5th straight sets victory of the fortnight. He lost his way briefly in the middle of the second set, but produced an explosive finish, underlying the power which makes him so dangerous. Draper did feel some discomfort in his right leg at the end of the first set. Strapping was required, and he later described a niggle, which did at least not get any worse.
Russell Fuller with that report on the US Open. That's the latest BBC News.
Hello there and welcome to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Nick Miles. China's relations with America and much of Europe are at a low ebb over Taiwan, human rights and economic strains. So Beijing is continuing to look south for friends and clients. And the South has come to Beijing this week in the form of 50 African leaders for a summit, the first such face-to-face meeting since the start of the pandemic, to strengthen ties. And what better way to do that than with the promise of cash? China's President Xi Jinping has pledged over $50 billion in loans for Africa over the next 3 years. Addressing the China-Africa Forum, he said China's relations with Africa couldn't be better.
China-Africa relations are now at their best period in history. Looking to the future, I propose raising China's bilateral relations with all African countries that have diplomatic ties to the level of strategic relationships.
So, what does he mean by that? I spoke to our correspondent in Beijing, Laura Bickman.
What he's meaning is he wants China to work together with African nations and cleave themselves away from Western influence. This is about China trying to raise its influence in a continent that is rich in minerals, that is rich in oil. And when the African nations are developing, China wants them to look towards Beijing, not elsewhere, not the United States, not the European Union, and certainly not the likes of the UK. They want African nations to look towards China. Now, China has a very long, deep relationship with African nations. However, in recent years, the continent has become quite a source of competition. And I think what China's beginning to do, certainly pre-pandemic, was they were building major infrastructure projects. You're looking at roads, railways, ports, right across different nations across Africa. But during the pandemic years, as China's economy begins to falter, those investments also began to falter.
concerned, there would be no great improvement. I think more equipment like armored vehicle and ammunitions had came to the country to support the national police and the 400 Kenyans to fight the gangs. But the lack of strategy is the biggest issue. Don't see any strategy from the Haitian government to put in place the right people in the position to develop a strategy to fight the gangs.
Let's speak to our Latin America and Caribbean editor, Vanessa Bush-Schluter now. Vanessa, tell us more about the latest situation across Haiti and why they put in place this extended state of emergency.
The reason why they've extended the state of emergency from the capital is that in the past months, the most egregious violence has always been concentrated in the capital, but that has changed. It is now spread to some of the provinces. Artibonite, for example, which is to the northwest of the capital, now has seen kidnappings and extortion and attacks on people who are traveling to get food. And so this situation obviously has prompted the measure taken by the Prime Minister to extend that state of emergency. But what many locals are saying is that with that extension of the state of emergency, there's no real change on the ground. It's not like more police are then deployed or more resources are sent to the police. And so they're saying those are just words, not really action.
And these 400 Kenyan peacekeepers are spread extremely thin.
Absolutely, and they themselves have been saying that they haven't really gone to the front line, as they term it, because they haven't been given the armored vehicles or the body armor to be able to do so. So the commander of the Kenyan forces has been speaking to media back in Kenya, bemoaning this very fact and also calling for other nations to help strengthen that multinational force.
Which brings us to Antony Blinken's visit today. What can we expect to possibly come out from it?
A spokesperson for the State Department has said that Mr. Blinken wants to get an idea on the ground of what is needed. But it sounds like he might also be calling for more nations to participate in that multinational force. And according to one article in the Miami Herald, he may even be considering changing the status of that multinational force to a UN-led force, which would mean that the funding would be guaranteed. Funding is the key problem here, and that's what the Kenyans and the Haitians are both saying.
Thanks, Vanessa. Vanessa Bush-Schluter there. Now, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is under huge pressure to agree a ceasefire with Hamas. In Israel, tens of thousands of people took to the streets after 6 more hostages who the Israeli army had hoped to rescue were found to have been killed. On Wednesday, he held a news conference. He said that he would not compromise his country's security to get a ceasefire, and that he would not order Israeli forces to leave the Philadelphia corridor. That's a buffer zone between Gaza and Egypt. Here's our international editor, Jeremy Bowen.
The focus at the moment is on this strip of land between Gaza and Egypt, which is called the Philadelphia corridor. It's about 8 miles long. And Khalil al-Hayya, who's the lead negotiator of Hamas, said to the Pan-Arab broadcaster Al Jazeera a couple of days ago that without withdrawing from the corridor, there will be no agreement. Now, the negotiators, of course, try and find ambiguous language that both sides can grab. But the thing is, they have other differences as well. For example, how many Palestinian prisoners are exchanged for Israeli hostages. It seems pretty clear that neither side really wants to find a way through at the moment, except on their absolute terms and not through a compromise. The Israeli parliament is in recess until the end of October. The way it's looking at the moment is that, Netanyahu feels he can ride out this